This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. You know, I gotta be honest. Today, I almost gave up. I almost threw in the towel and said, you know what? It doesn't matter what I say or what content I put together. Nobody is listening. Nothing is happening. And on top of it, knowing that my channel is constantly messed with as a result of two people who desperately want to control the internet, and they're doing everything they possibly can to beat you down, whether it be affecting your earnings or unsubscribing subscribers, making sure the channel is not growing. I'm sure many of you noticed that I've been stuck at 111 for months now. Now, with this video, I fully anticipate YouTube suppressing and ensuring that it's not going to get seen. So if that be the case and this channel gets another violation, I will be going over to X and I will put this on blast. And when I say put it on blast, I will be relentless on X to make sure that the right people in our government who actually serve the people will be looking at it. So if you're listening, Harry and Meghan, I hope you find what I know fascinating. Folks, don't forget to like this video before we get started. Get comfortable and let's dive in. To kick this party off on the right foot, I'd like to bring up this beautiful tweet that was posted back in October of 2020 by Representative Jason Smith. He writes, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are using foreign titles to campaign against President Trump and interfere with our election. Today, I asked the British government to put a stop to it. See my full letter below. And let's review it real quick because it is a treasure. He writes, Dear Ambassador Pierce, I'm writing to express concern with their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and their continued interference in the United States presidential election. As you know, the British royal family has long observed a policy of strict neutrality in regard to political matters. I am therefore concerned by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's recent comments regarding the United States presidential election, especially given international conversations surrounding foreign interference in our elections and the Duke's status as a guest in the United States. Last month, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex recorded a joint broadcast urging American citizens to register to vote and to reject hate speech, misinformation, and online negativity. The Duchess of Sussex, whose political opinions are thinly disguised and widely reported, went so far as to label the 2020 election the most important election of our lifetime. These actions represent a serious breach of the British royal family's policy of political neutrality and as inappropriate act of domestic interference by one of our closest allies. Oh, Jason Smith, if you only knew the type of interference that we're about to get into. Additionally, while I understand the Duke and Duchess no longer utilize the style of his or her Royal Highness, they nevertheless retain these prefixes and remain known as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It is also my understanding the royal family has stated these comments were made in a personal capacity, and the Duke and Duchess are no longer working members of the royal family. However, it is my view that titles and privileges they retain by permission of Her Majesty the Queen, given with the advice and consent of her government, prevent the Duke and Duchess from separating comments made in a personal capacity from their official position within the British royal family. Therefore, by allowing the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to retain their titles and these political comments to continue, the British government is effectively condoning interference in the 2020 United States presidential election from officials at the highest level of the British establishment. Allow me to read this last sentence again. Therefore, by allowing the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to retain their titles and these political comments to continue, the British government is effectively condoning interference in the 2020 United States presidential election from officials at the highest level of the British establishment. He finishes off the letter by saying, I respectfully request the British government ensure the Duke and Duchess of Sussex no longer attempt to interfere in our election or be stripped of all titles, styles, and privileges which they currently retain. I respectfully request you convey these concerns to both Her Majesty the Queen and to Her Majesty's government. Respectfully, Jason Smith, Member of Congress. A couple of things that I would like to point out so you can see where I'm going with this. Firstly, the government never responded back to Jason Smith. Did they take any action? No. Meghan and Harry still have their titles, they still use it, and are still getting involved with our elections. Secondly, it says here specifically about Meghan and Harry talking about rejecting hate speech and misinformation. So back in 2020, they were on this bandwagon of censorship. I mean, literally from the very beginning. Now, I'm pointing this out because this is the one thing that Harry and Meghan have been consistent with from the very beginning. Everything else, if you notice, has been an absolute clown show. I'm going to be the one to say it. All the dramas and all the failures and flops and headlines, all of that was intentional. Before I go ahead and tell you what is going on, this is not conspiracy. This is 100% fact. From as early as 2017, military-grade censorship operations have been launched against Americans in efforts to censor free speech. Harry and Meghan are very much a part of this psychological war that has been launched on Americans. Now, if you've been paying attention to the recent events between the Megxit accounts and the shitsters that have been drumming up drama here in this community, you should have heard people mentioning these crazy lunatics saying that we are at war. Like Duchess of Sussex said it the best.
And I heard a disturbing voicemail that was left for somebody, a YouTuber, where they were threatening this YouTuber because this YouTuber was talking about the Markles. They kicked her out of the Discord group. I'm sure she cares. But left a threatening message saying, you know, whatever it said. But the thing that I took away from that was, you don't understand. This is war. We're at war. Well, who says that? Who's at war? I mean, are any of you at war with anybody? I would say that I'm at odds with the Sussex. Well, the Sussex squad is at odds with me all the time. But, you know, when I hear we're at war, you don't understand what's going on. You can't grasp what's going on here. We're at war. Do these people think we're in the Cold War?
You would be correct, Don. They are behaving as if they're in the Cold War and following Russian tactics, which is exactly what is happening. So now let's take a step back to understand the origins of how this complex started. Mike Benz explains that this was about preventing the rise in populism beginning around 2014 with Obama and the situation with Crimea.
So they brought to bear this very powerful censorship apparatus, really starting in 2014, and it started with the military and the intelligence and the diplomatic corps. These same blob institutions created this architecture initially to stop Russian propaganda after Crimea in 2014. NATO developed this doctrine called From Tanks to Tweets, that NATO was no longer primarily about tank warfare. It was about controlling tweets, because tweets are how people get elected. And at the time, NATO was saying that the biggest threat to NATO was that people would vote their way out of NATO or would vote to not give funds for foreign wars. That was a bigger threat than Russian aggression. So what they did is they said anyone who supports Russia or is NATO critical or is against the foreign policy establishment at the domestic level is effectively operating, they're helping Russia. And so even if they're not doing Russian disinformation, we can still use our national security powers, our national interest powers, to get them censored because they are helping an adversary state. And once that apparatus was put in place, they began to apply it to everything, to COVID, to election disinformation, to climate disinformation. And it grew to be this very all-powerful tool until, you know, as I mentioned, 2 years ago, the tide started to turn, both within the U.S. government through Congress and the U.S. private sector through new freedoms on Twitter and YouTube, and the rise of, on Twitter and Facebook and even the rise of a somewhat robust YouTube alternative ecosystem like Rumble. So now they've escalated that, and they're putting pressure on countries like Brazil and regions like the EU. And all over 140 countries now, we have these counter-disinformation programs, which are purely designed to stop the rise of domestic populists who might challenge the foreign policy establishment.
So now with that in mind, we have to now look at the interests of our strongest ally, the UK. And when you look at the UK's affiliations with NATO, with the United Nations, with the World Economic Forum, I mean, literally, they were all founding members of these organizations that are pushing for this one world government. So the threat of populism coming in, such as Donald Trump, totally wrecks all of this. These are folks that want to continue war. They want to continue the suffering. They want to transform. They want us to do this and that, and then finally be enslaved under this one world government. We're seeing it happen, play out in real time this week. When Donald Trump got elected into office, he threw a wrench in this Agenda 2030 plan because he made it about Americans as opposed to serving other countries and allowing other countries to walk all over the United States. He had closed our borders. He reduced the illegal migration coming into this country. He was getting rid of terrorists. He had the country in a safe position, or as safe as he could in the 4 years that he had to work with. But look at what's going on right now. I think it's pretty safe to say if you're watching this channel, you cannot honestly say that you are better off now than you were 4 years ago. There ain't no way. Unless you are a millionaire and one of these elites, then I doubt you'd be watching this channel. So this series that I did a couple weeks ago appears to have really upset the apple cart. In this TRG series, I go back and I take a closer look at the media that was fed to the public when Meghan Markle first came onto the scene, from the beginning of her getting engaged to her friend Nanaki Pretty submitting all these childhood photos, as well as videos showing clear evidence that they have been digitally altered by using AI technology. In addition, I also started to point out the inconsistencies with the Markle family narratives that they spun to us over the last 6 years. As a result of this series, it inspired other YouTubers to go ahead and look closer and have their own discussions in their spaces. It has now come to light that it turns out Samantha Markle and Thomas Jr. didn't like that people were looking closer and scrutinizing the things that they themselves had put out there in the public domain. Now, after observing this situation from start to finish, what's very clear here is that Samantha and Jr. were behind the scenes manipulating other content creators to do their bidding. Bidding in the sense of attacking other content creators who challenged their narratives. And what we witnessed was the marginalization and discrediting, as well as naming and shaming of content creators like myself who spoke out against these narratives, as well as the lies that are clearly in front of your face. Some of the creators that you see on your screen, and I'm not saying all of them, knew exactly what they were doing and the effect that it was going to have on certain content creators. Those effects include financial loss, reputational damage, as well as injecting fear not only into the audience, but also on the content creators to dare not speak out again about certain topics. But here's the thing, it backfired because it now just opened them up to more scrutiny and exposing now what I'm about to show you that has been going on. Now, after I finished the Biggest Fraud Alive series, I was asked a lot this one question. What is the purpose of all this deceit by Meghan Markle and Prince Harry? Particularly Meghan Markle. From the very start, her story has been a lie, and that's because it's all by design. The one thing that we've seen Harry been truly focused on here in the United States is pertaining to mental health. We saw him in the Me You Can't See. He joined as the Chimpo, a Better Up. He also did this World Health Summit with none other than the Surgeon General of the United States. And now they have this Fugazi network called the Parents Network. And the reoccurring theme here that's consistent across the board with Harry are the social media online harms that's being caused with misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, using mental health as the driver in order to drive legislation in cracking down on free speech.
Young people today are disproportionately affected by negative experiences online, and mental health issues stemming from their digital interactions. They're navigating an environment that is often hostile and overwhelming. Reports of anxiety, depression, and social isolation linked to these platforms have surged in recent years, creating a crisis that cannot be ignored.
Everything that Meghan and Harry have been doing for the last 6 years, including the stuff that just doesn't make any kind of sense, all ties back to what was said earlier in this video by Mike Benz. These government bodies, as of 2014, had been fearing that populism was on the rise. And that is because these government bodies and agencies were no longer able to control the flow of information as a result of social media allowing many voices to be shared on a platform and to be seen. What it really boils down to is about influence and how to sway the mind. It's a very well-known fact that the CIA plays a major role in influence here, not only in foreign countries, but also here domestically.
Let's talk about the function of the CIA. I think a lot of us have an impression that all the CIA does is gather intelligence. Intelligence is information, of course. Now, one would think that if you obtained information that was based upon fact, and if that is so, what did you do with it?
Well, one of the four principal functions of the CIA is to gather intelligence and ideally forward it to the president, the users of information, the policymakers, as they say. There are other functions, however, some of them more legitimate than others. One is to run secret wars, the covert action that's written and talked about so much, like what's happening in Nicaragua today from Honduras. Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories.
Did you buy his confidence with true stories?
You buy his confidence and set him up. We've seen this happen recently with Jack Anderson, for example, who has his intelligence sources, and he has also admitted that he's been set up by them. You know, every fifth story just simply being false. You also work on their human vulnerabilities to recruit them in a classic sense, to make them your agent so that you can control what they do, so you don't have to set them up sort of, you know, by putting one over on them. So you can say, here, plant this one next Tuesday.
Can you do this with responsible reporters?
Yes, the Church Committee brought it out in 1975, and then Woodward and Bernstein put an article in Rolling Stone a couple of years later. 400 journalists cooperating with the CIA, including some of the biggest names in the business, to consciously introduce the stories into the press.
Well, give me a concrete example of how you use the press this way, how a false story is planted and how you got it published.
Well, for example, in my war, the Angola war that I helped to manage, 1/3 of my staff was propaganda. Ironically, it's called covert action inside the CIA. Outside, that means the violent part. I had propagandists all over the world, principally in London, Kinshasa, and Zambia. We would take stories which we would write and put them in the Zambia Times, and then pull them out and send them to a journalist on our payroll in Europe. But his cover story, you see, would be that he had gotten them from his stringer in Lusaka, who had gotten them from the Zambia Times. We had the complicity of the government of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, if you will, to put these false stories into his newspapers. But after that point, the journalists, Reuters and AFP, the management was not witting of it. Now, our contact man in Europe was, and we pumped just dozens of stories about Cuban atrocities, Cuban rapists. In one case, we had the Cuban rapists caught and tried by the Ovimbundu maidens who had been their victims, and then we ran photographs that made almost every newspaper in the country of the Cubans being executed by the Ovimbundu women who supposedly had been their victims.
But these were fake photos?
Oh, absolutely. We didn't know of one single atrocity committed by the Cubans. It was pure, raw, false propaganda to create a an illusion of communists, eating babies for breakfast and that sort of totally false propaganda.
So, of course, this always goes back to power and money, and the United States, or the deep state, doesn't want to lose its position as a global superpower because that's where they're making all their money. The unnecessary wars, as well as overthrowing governments. I mean, when we look at this woman that we're calling Meghan and her ties to the deep state, it now makes total sense why in 2016, this woman that we're calling Meghan puts up this post about the EU and Brexit. Meghan is tied to people in the CIA. Make no mistake about that. She may not be a CIA agent, but she is tied to it within the deep state. Even though, on the surface, for PR purposes, the UK and the US are supposed to be tight allies, don't think for a second that behind the scenes within the Chia, there aren't discussions talking about destabilizing the institution, the monarchy, because of what it's rooted on, which is Christianity. The purpose of Meghan being planted in there was to weaken the British monarchy's geopolitical position using race. This is the platform that Meghan has been using to damage not only this capitalist institution, but also capitalism in the UK. Meghan has been a very big supporter of socialist ideologies as well as pushing for totalitarian regime using the United Nations in this one world government power grab. The elitist parasites like Meghan and Harry believe in free market capitalism for themselves. But for everybody else, we are to be enslaved and at their disposal. So if they want to test a new drug, if they want to take our property, they're already taking and grooming the kids for their sick perversion. They feel that they have the right to do so because they've labeled themselves in this so-called ruling class. They don't want people to know and or criticize the hypocrisy as well as the behavior of some of the things that they've been doing, such as stealing our money and taking advantage of vulnerable people through charity. So now when we look at it from the UK side, Harry's objective is the same as Meghan's, which is to prevent the rise of populism, aka Donald Trump getting back into office. Harry is also in alignment with this totalitarian regime, and the work that he's doing inside the United States is to assist in transforming the US into a weak socialist state. This global transformation that they're trying to achieve cannot be completed unless they figure out a way to do away with the First Amendment and seizing back the control of information that's shared online, as well as what people are allowed to say and think. This is the mission that Harry keeps talking about. I think what's really important here to understand now is that this military-grade operations to censor Americans actually began in January of 2017. Obama wastes no time in kicking off a White House meeting instructing a former British intelligence analyst to create a counter-disinformation project to stop a repeat of 2016. As the censorship framework had been underway, Obama meets with Prince Harry in May, and then he meets with him again in December of 2017, at which Obama warns over divisive social media use in this interview that Harry did with him.
I think what I will do is the social media landscape has changed dramatically since then. Issues of trolling, extremism, fake news, and cyberbullying are major social issues. Right. Is there more that you could have done as president to get ahead of some of these issues, do you think?
The question, I think, really has to do with how do we harness this technology in a way that allows a multiplicity of voices, allows a diversity of views, but doesn't lead to a balkanization of our society, but rather continues to promote ways of finding common ground. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure government can legislate that.
No, they can't, and he knows that, because that would be a violation of the First Amendment. And he gives the answer on how to get it done.
But what I do believe is that all of us in leadership have to find ways in which we can recreate a common space on the internet.
And who else better to do that than the Archewell Fugazi Public Charity, as their motto is building a better online world. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have spent years working to explore and address how the online world has radically changed our way of life and the impact it has on trust, families, mental health, and the rise of hate. And they were off to the races, and by 2019, US and UK military contractors created this sweeping plan for global censorship. U.S. military contractor Pablo Brewer, UK defense researcher Sarah Jane, or S.J. Terp, and Chris Krebs, former director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, were part of an anti-disinformation group called the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, or CTIL, that officially began as the volunteer project of data scientists and defense and intelligence veterans, but whose tactics over time appear to have been absorbed into multiple official and I would say unofficial projects, including those of the Department of Homeland Security. Chris Krebs was tightly aligned with Prince Harry, as not only was he a co-author, but also the co-chair for that stupid report on the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder. A key component of this UK defense researcher, Sarah Jane, was to insert this concept of cognitive security into the fields of cybersecurity and information security. These people really sought to promote the idea of cognitive security as a rationale for government involvement in censorship activities. In a 2019 podcast, Sarah Jane Terp says, "Cognitive security is the thing you want to have. You want to protect that cognitive layer. It's about pollution, misinformation, disinformation is a form of pollution across the internet." What they had been doing was painting a clear picture of a highly coordinated and sophisticated effort by the US and UK governments to build a domestic censorship effort and influence operations similar to the ones they've used in foreign countries. The CTIL framework and the public-private model are the seeds of what both the US and UK would put into place in 2020 and 2021, including masking censorship within cybersecurity institutions and counter disinformation agendas. There was a heavy focus on stopping disfavored narratives, not just wrong facts, and pressuring social media platforms to take down information or take other actions to prevent content from going viral. The organization also did research on individuals posting certain hashtags and kept a spreadsheet with details from their Twitter bios. The group also discussed requesting takedowns and reporting website domains to registrars. And that's exactly what was going on with anyone who talked about Meghan Markle or criticized her. They were then added to this hate tracker by Bot Sentinel and monitored for their speech. I specifically remember this period of time where people were getting deplatformed left and right for merely just saying that they didn't believe Meghan Markle gave birth to those children. And this wasn't just happening on Twitter. This was also happening to people on Facebook, as well as getting deplatformed on YouTube. And don't worry, I'm going to get to Yankee Wally. We will talk about her later on in this multi-part series. But the point that I'm trying to make here is the tactics that were being used by CTIL are the same exact tactics that Meghan and Harry were using to silence and suppress any critics. Without a doubt, Harry and Meghan are using mental health as the cover for really what they're doing, which is this cognitive security. Why do you think they went to Stanford in February of 2020 to see a neuroscientist and talk about cognitive brain function? What it all boils down to is really about controlling the mind, controlling what people say, what people think, how they feel, and what they believe in. And this is a major reason why Harry and Meghan have been going after the youth. And it's not only Harry and Meghan, but the Obamas do it, the Clintons do it, NATO's doing it, and even the UN is trying to secure and lock down on the future generations with their Pact for the Future. Let's not forget what President JFK had to say.
Washington, D.C., May the 25th, 1961.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Vice President, my co-partners in government, gentlemen, ladies, the Constitution imposes upon me the obligation to, from time to time, give to the Congress information on the state of the Union. While this has traditionally been interpreted as an annual affair, this tradition has been broken in extraordinary times. These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. Our strength, as well as our convictions, have imposed upon this nation the role of leader in freedom's cause. No role in history could be more difficult or more important. We stand for freedom. That is our conviction for ourselves. That is our only commitment to others. No friend, no neutral, and no adversary should think otherwise. We are not against any man or any nation or any system, except as it is hostile to freedom. Nor am I here to present a new military doctrine bearing any one name or aimed at any one area. I am here to promote the freedom doctrine. The great battleground for the defense and expansion of freedom today is the whole southern half of the globe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, the lands of the rising people. Their revolution is the greatest in human history. They seek an end to injustice, tyranny, and exploitation. More than an end, they seek a beginning. And theirs is a revolution which we would support regardless of the Cold War and regardless of which political or economic route they should choose to freedom. For the adversaries of freedom did not create the revolution, nor did they create the conditions which compel it. But they are seeking to ride the crest of its wave, to capture it for themselves. Yet their aggression is more often concealed than open. They have fired no missiles, and their troops are seldom seen. They send arms, agitators, aid, technicians, and propaganda to every troubled area. But where fighting is required, it is usually done by others, by guerrillas striking at night, by assassins striking alone, assassins who have taken the lives of 4,000 civil officers in the last 12 months in Vietnam alone, by subversives and saboteurs and insurrectionists who in some cases control whole areas inside of independent nations. With these formidable weapons, the adversaries of freedom plan to consolidate their territory, to exploit, to control, and finally to destroy the hopes of the world's newest nations. And they have ambition to do it before the end of this decade. It is a contest of will and purpose, as well as force and violence, a battle for minds and souls as well as lives and territory. And in that contest, we cannot stand aside. We stand as we have always stood from our earliest beginnings, for the independence and equality of all nations. This nation was born of revolution and raised in freedom, and we do not intend to leave an open road for despotism. There is no single simple policy which meets this challenge. Experience has taught us that no one nation has the power or the wisdom to solve all the problems of the world or manage its revolutionary tides, that extending our commitments does not always increase our security, that any initiative carries with it the risk of a temporary defeat, that nuclear weapons cannot prevent subversion, that no free people can be kept free without will and energy of their own, and that no two nations or situations are exactly alike. Yet there is much we can do and must do.
At this year's NATO Youth Summit, they're all about shaping their tomorrow. And if you notice at the bottom there, look who is a partner. Aspen Institute. And now the UN this week has made a serious play while we were all distracted in going ahead and approving and adopting this digital compact. Listen to how scary this is.
And the Global Digital Compact is the third part, and that passed.
Yeah. Essentially what this is meant to do is a few different things. It's meant to dramatically increase global governance of artificial intelligence. The whole point of the Global Digital Compact is to get everybody off the internet that the United Nations doesn't like, to silence people who are not going along with it, and to create a vast propaganda network that is going to constantly be pumping out their own form of misinformation and disinformation, all in the name of allegedly getting to the truth, which of course is not what they're doing.
So in order to understand this military-grade censorship operation that Harry and Meghan have been conducting on the global public since 2020, you have to understand the framework that they have been using by the CTI League called AMIT, which stands for Adversarial, Misinformation, and Influence Tactics and Techniques. AMIT is a disinformation framework that included many offensive actions, including working to influence government policy, discrediting alternative media, using bots and sock puppets, pre-bunking, and pushing counter messaging. So this framework that was created was actually based off of Russian tactics, KGB style. Now, each one of these gray squares in this AMIT framework represent a skill or tactic to be executed on in order to sway public opinion, whether it be disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. Regardless of what type of information it is, it's designed to cause chaos and divide people at the end of the day. So how many of these gray squares have Harry and Meghan used in order to carry out an attack on the American people? It's everything you see here, highlighted in yellow. Let's go through the unethical influence, or shall I say a better term, the psychological warfare that Harry and Meghan have conducted not only on Americans, but the rest of the world. Well, alrighty, let's kick off with the first gray box, which is the 5 Ds: dismiss, distort, distract, dismay, and divide. When you're looking at this tactic, dismiss means push back against criticism by dismissing your critics. This might be arguing that the critics use a different standard for you than with other actors or themselves, or arguing that their criticism is biased. Now, how many times have we heard that, oh, Kate eats avocados, but when Meghan does it, she's like committing genocide, or Archie wasn't going to be given the title of prince because of his skin color, or the default de facto response when they can't think of anything else is that the British media is racist. The next one that we have here is distort, which is twisting the narrative, taking information or artifacts like images and change the framing around it. A great example here is the Meghan made Kate cry, and Meghan flipping that around, saying that it was Kate that made her cry. Other good examples of distortion are the rumors surrounding the Prince William affair, as well as now making Catherine be a racist when she's totally not a racist. Now, this next Russian tactic that Meghan and Harry use, which I think that they use a lot, is distract, which is shifting attention to a different narrative or actor, for instance, by accusing critics of the same activity that they've accused you of. There are so many examples that we could choose from. In this case, I picked bullying because Harry and Meghan are the biggest bullies out there on the planet. And what they went ahead and did was they flipped it and said that they were bullied out of the family and they weren't supported. And it's the reason why Megxit took place in the first place. Next on the list is dismay, which is threaten the critic or narrator of events. For instance, threaten journalists or news outlets reporting on a story. Now, how many times do Meghan and Harry do this? It feels like it's almost every day. Right off the top of my head, Piers Morgan. Remember the day after that Oprah Live Fest? Piers Morgan said he didn't believe her. And Meghan called the ITV studio up, and later that afternoon, Piers Morgan was out of a job. And the last one that we have on here, which we know a lot about, is divide, which is creating conflict between subgroups to widen divisions in a community. This just happened to us, folks. Now, the whole reason why they have conducted this psychological war onto the public is to not only compel and weaken the institution's geopolitical position using race, but also impact the mental health of the public, proving their point as to why they need to regulate the internet more. The whole reason for why people are so angry is because they are behind it. They're stoking the fire. Now, the next gray box that is filled is leverage existing narratives. Use or adapt existing narrative themes where narratives are the baseline stories of a target audience. Narratives form the bedrock of our worldviews. New information is understood through the process firmly grounded in this bedrock. If new information is not consistent with the prevailing narratives of an audience, it will be ignored. Effective campaigns will frame their misinformation in the context of these narratives. Highly effective campaigns will make extensive use of audience-appropriate archetypes and meta-narratives throughout their content creation and amplification practices.
What I was saying is that this whole notion, we didn't know she was black. The language that has been used. Eamon Holmes on British TV called her uppity. Now, if you know the connotations of that word, the word uppity was a word used by white people to talk about black people who were acting above their station in being able to speak properly and being able to read and stuff. And for him to use such a word is laughably racist. And for him to then say that he didn't know what it meant. If you're going to use a word on national TV that you don't know what it means or what its true meaning is, then maybe you should look it up before you use it. So don't tell me that there are no, or we didn't know we were racist. It's absolute rubbish. The problem is everybody looks at American racism and thinks, oh yeah, American racism is so into your face. British racism is just more cleverly done. Americans brought black people from Africa and put them in plantations in America. It was very much in your face. The Brits and Europeans hid it. They did it on Caribbean islands. They hid their dirty deeds, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it still happened. And this is why we have a problem with discussing racism now, because they've spent so many hundreds of years hiding it so well.
Next tactic that we have here is competing narratives. Advanced competing narratives connected to the same issue deny an incident and at the same time dismiss it. Suppressing or discouraging narratives already spreading requires an alternative. The most simple set of narrative techniques in response would be the construction and promotion of contradictory alternatives centered on denial, deflection, dismissal, countercharges, excessive standards of proof, bias in prohibition or enforcement, and so on. These competing narratives allow loyalists cover, but are less compelling to opponents and fence-sitters than campaigns built around existing narratives or highly explanatory master narratives. Competing narratives, as such, are especially useful in the fire hose of misinformation approach. A good example of this would be the most recent incident with The Hollywood Reporter, reporting that Meghan was a dictator in heels. And then this week, Meghan comes out with Us Weekly's glossy, glowing review of how Meghan is the most awesome boss in the world. Now, I do believe that this was all a distraction to keep attention off of Prince Harry while he was here in New York City doing his thing with the globalists. I truly do believe that. Next tactic on this list is creating fake social media profiles, pages, groups, etc. We know that Meghan has thousands of those. Create key social engineering assets needed to amplify content, manipulate algorithms, fool public and/or specific incident campaign targets. Computational propaganda depends substantially on false perceptions of credibility and acceptance. By creating fake users and groups with a variety of interests and commitments, attackers can assure that their messages both come from trusted sources and appear more widely adopted than they actually are. What you're looking at here is from Ian Sexton's X account or Twitter account at the time. This is a visualization of Ian Sexton's tweets and how it connects to all the bots in his network, the bots that he is managing and running. Traditionally, when bots are being used, they're normally there to amplify a message. So when you look at the hashtags that are associated to this cluster, you're seeing certain hashtags that are designed to not only cause division, but also drum up anger and hatred on purpose, like abolish the monarchy, the British royal family are snakes, you've got Prince William is a racist. All of this hatred, anger, and bullying that we see online is a result of people like Meghan and Harry who have people like this who are amplifying these messages. And this just piggybacks onto the next one, which is create fake social media profiles, pages, groups in which computational propaganda depends substantially on false perceptions of credibility and acceptance. By creating fake users and groups with a variety of interests and commitments, attackers can ensure that their messages both come from trusted sources and appear more widely adopted than they actually are. Indicators here are sets of profiles with the same profile image or profile text. Now, in this case, I'm using this example because when you look at these tweets, you can't really tell if there are real people or if they are bots behind the account. But what gives it away that makes it most likely that these are bots is the fact that each one of them uses this brazen hussy. Now, if you've been around and know how the Sugars talk, this brazen hussy references the Sussex Squad. Chances are that all of these accounts are paid bots. So I think this is a really good place to stop to allow you to digest a lot of this information because I know it's a lot. And we'll pick back up in part 2, going through the rest of these tactics to show you how Harry and Meghan have been carrying out a military-grade operation that has been censoring not only Americans, but also others around the world. So before I go, I want people to understand that the censorship industrial complex combines established methods of psychological manipulation, some developed by the U.S. military during the global war on terror, with highly sophisticated tools from computer science, including artificial intelligence. The complex's leaders are driven by the fear that the internet and social media platforms empower populist, alternative, and fringe personalities and views, which they regard as destabilizing. The fact of the matter is that this British prince and his American bitch wife have been highly engaged and aligned with our U.S. military. Not only that, but as you can see here, Harry has a relationship with the Pentagon as well as high-ranking official from NATO. Carrying out this military-grade censorship operations on Americans on behalf of the U.S. government and partaking in the censorship industrial complex, this psychological operation and abuse that we have been taken could be seen as domestic terrorism. So now when we look at our U.S. law, 18 U.S.C., Title 18, Crimes and Criminal Procedures, the definition of domestic terrorism means activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, and B, appear to be intended with 1, to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, which certainly has been happening as a result of this military-grade censorship operation that Meghan and Harry have been conducting over the last 4 years, and it's still ongoing. Those threats that Thomas Markle Jr. made against our recollections may vary. Those comments could actually come back to bite him, considering he is a part of this psychological operation that Harry and Meghan have executed onto the American people. In addition, we will not forget those Sugars who relentlessly attacked the Duchess of Sussex, who has a known mental illness, and still they went after her by doxing her, stalking her, and threatening her. So I think all those things should be filed away and given to now the FBI, because what I see here is the same exact thing that Jason Smith saw back in 2020. By allowing the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to retain their titles and all the accoutrements and privileges that come with it, the British government is effectively condoning the psychological warfare that Harry and Meghan have unleashed onto the American people, essentially approved from the officials at the highest level of the British establishment.
What we're seeing here is in real time are people with totalitarian tendencies, I think we can call them totalitarians when they behave in those ways, undermining democracy, attacking free speech, spreading disinformation, demonizing and dehumanizing people, all motivated out of the hunt for heretics. Really, it's really out of a kind of dogmatic belief in their particular worldview and seeking to stomp out voices that don't conform. So to then know that the state is actually prosecuting a war against heretical thought and that it's coming directly out of the government and that the people in it, because we sometimes go, is this organic? Is it coming from the people or is it coming from the government? It's particular people in the government who are then engaged in these kinds of activities, taking advantage of their positions in places like the FBI and CIA to engage in this kind of illegal persecution of people who think differently and have different kinds of thought.
I think everybody should know by now that these two are not about helping community. They are on this globalist agenda supporting the United Nations and this one world government. I'm sure many of you are going to be asking me, well, what can we do? What can we do? I think the most that you can do right now is create the awareness. We know that right now these two have been a big thorn in all of our sides in trying to suppress and violate our First Amendment rights. When I'm finished with this series, I will be sending this to someone in the FBI, hoping that they put a stop to this nonsense. What they have been participating in with our government is, in fact, illegal. And I think it's time now that they get called out for it and are held accountable in our criminal justice system. To be continued. Part 2, coming soon. Bye.
I was such a fraud.